Just to be clear, this video is not going to be all too well structured, as there's no real thesis that I'm presenting here. It's more a thought talk about something that's been on my mind ever since I finished DGS2. Speaking of finishing DGS2, I did so about a month ago, and it'll probably be longer by the time this video is uploaded, and I really liked it. I didn't necessarily adore the game like so many other fans did. I think it had major issues with its pacing, to be honest, but it was still a very good ace-attorney game that I think pushes the series in the right direction, assuming it's even going to continue walking. But to be honest, even if it doesn't, this game is a fine enough way to end the series, in my opinion. That's not what's important for this video, as this isn't a review or anything along those lines. Instead, I would like to speak about mainly the final two cases of this game, and how the structure of them, and even DGS2 as a whole really, started to make me doubt the way I've critiqued ace-attorney games for quite a long time. What I mean is that generally, in order to sort of compare one ace-attorney game to the rest of the franchise, you would simply look at the cases and directly compare them to the equivalently numbered case in each game. So you would take the first case and its quality based upon where it ranks with all the other first cases in the series, and then you would do the same with the second case, and so on. Doing this with every case would then gain a general idea of where this game ranks with the rest of the series. This is often the method I've seen, at the very least. Depending on who you are, it may seem asinine to even care enough to do this, which is fair enough in all honesty, since these are just video games. However, this is a method I've seen used constantly to assess the quality of these games with each other, and I myself have used it for the longest time as well. So yeah, if you played DGS2, you probably have a decent idea of why I'm mentioning all of this, because this game, the 4th and 5th case, are just one case. Well, alright, that does sound quite a bit odd, so it's probably more accurate to say that the 4th and 5th episode are just one case, and to be frank, I don't really see the reason as to why they split up into two cases, unlike perhaps Doom Destinies, which also had its 4th and 5th episodes with two separate halves of one case, and we'll discuss the full ramifications of that. But for now, it's at least easy to deduce why they're separated like this, so the main suspect ends up changing at the end of episode 4. With DGS2 on the other hand, the decision to split these two honestly feels so arbitrary, and if anyone can find any convincing narrative-related reason as to why the split exists, I'd personally be very interested in knowing. I say narrative-related reason specifically because I can't help but feel the actual reason this was done is because they needed a very long final case, as well as a really long third case now that I think about it, and they just didn't have enough of a budget to have an extra 4th case alongside of that, which isn't surprising considering the history of this game's development. Despite all that, I guess they didn't want this to be a 4-case game, so they just decided that the final case was long enough that they could split it. Of course, this is all speculation. I'd be interested in knowing if that was actually the reason. Perhaps they were motivated by reasons related to storytelling, although I doubt it for whatever reason. And with how rushed the rest of the game is, I wouldn't be surprised if I was at least near the mark. I mean, I guess the judge changes and you get new music, but is that really enough to justify the split? It isn't for me at the very least. But whatever the reason may be, this is just how the game is structured, and I found that because of it, using the method I described earlier to judge these cases is honestly sort of nonsensical, because these cases are so interconnected that you really cannot judge them by themselves without doing disservice to them. Because if you judge the 4th case by itself, it doesn't end in a satisfactory manner. I mean, you do admittedly get a prequel twist, but nothing that can really be considered an ending. With episode 5, the issue with seen as its own case is even more obvious, because it doesn't even start as one. Just to be clear, there is by no means criticism I have with the game, which is actually the most important point I'm trying to convey. These cases literally come right after each other, so when you actually consider the overall game, there's no reason to separate them when critiquing. They're clearly one case and one story that just happened to get turned into two. This is really interesting, as it sort of starts to make you question whether the direct case comparison method when it comes to these two series even makes much sense. I suppose I'm probably not presenting this in the most clear-cut way possible, so I'd like to ask a simple question. Does the ability of an ace-attorney case to be good on its own matter to you? I suppose there's also sort of branching out into a discussion of how you see an ace-attorney game overall, as a collection of cases, or an overall story. Of course, it's both. I think there is at least some objectivity in saying that, but what side of it you prioritise when it comes to your view of the series overall will shape your answer to the question. I don't honestly know if I have an answer to that question though, if I'm going to be honest, which is why I find the Great Ace-attorney 2 and the way it structures its last two cases to be so interesting. For example, let's imagine I'm comparing DGS2 to Apollo Justice, though it's actually a 4-case game. This would be a pretty easy comparison to Poor Justice, as that game also only has 4 cases. In this case, I would personally say I prefer the first 2 cases in Poor Justice, but the second 2 cases in DGS2, and so would be equal, but I would still consider DGS2 to be superior still, because I value the third and final case of these games more, specifically the final case, for reasons I'm sure most could understand, so I'm not going to enter into describing any details related to that. However, now let's see the situation as it actually is, and what's strange is that to an extent my perception does change. It's the same with the first 3 or so cases, but then we get into the final 2, and then this sort of strange sort of situation appears because of how I feel about the 2 halves of what is essentially the final case of the game. That being that I think episode 5 is better than episode 4, which may or may not be an unpopular opinion. I really have no idea when it comes to that, but basically the game looks better, because if you were to compare the final case, I would say episode 5 is even more superior to episode 4 of AJ than combining episode 4 and 5, due to issues I will not go into detail regarding episode 4 of DGS2, and the 4th case almost acts as this instant perk to DGS2 by looking at it this way, because it's basically just a good case that Apollo Justice has no equivalent to. This is the reason I really don't like thinking of DGS2's 4th case of ranking with other 4th cases, because the only case with which I feel like I could honestly compare it to isn't that of Dual Destinies. With all the other games, I'm just stuck in this weird conundrum because I have no clue how I can look at this case as something standing on its own. Funnily enough, some may even akin this entire situation to the DGS duology, as it could be argued that the first game isn't really something that can stand on its own, and neither can the second game for that matter, and this leads to all sorts of questions like, are these flaws in the games, or is it more just limitation? I've even seen some argue that they should not even be judged as separate games, which I question, but I do understand where such opinions are coming from. Going any further than this when it comes to discussions about tied games and their abilities to stand on their own versus their increasing value based upon your familiarity with previous games or even later games, sometimes is probably beyond the scope of this video, but I still feel like it's something worth briefly mentioning because it came to mind. I've been focusing a lot on DGS2 because it's the game that's sort of the catalyst behind the existence of this video, but there are many other examples of this. What about Turnabout Revolution, an episode that has 2 separate cases combined into one? Should you judge this case as one, or should you instead split the civil trial and the trial in Kurayan? I'm not going to give you an answer necessarily, but I've seen both, and I couldn't help but wonder what exactly would happen, in my opinion, if I were to change my perception. Generally, I've seen this case as pretty good, as I really like the first half, but I think the second half is just okay. So if you were to separate it, you would have one case that I think is really good and one case that I think is okay. In this situation, you could almost argue it makes the game seem worse, I think what I do, as the second half, which I consider the weaker link, is now the one being compared to all the other final cases. Then again, if you just separate them and remove the 4th case, I'd suffer less in this game. But humour aside, I don't know if I'm doing a good job at showing how, to an extent, the way in which the episodes in Ace Attorney as section could be completely arbitrary, and still they would have an impact on enjoyment if you were to rank it this way, and you don't have to agree with the personal opinions I've laid out to understand that, or at least I hope so. One major point that I want to bring up is case length and how that's an interesting factor to consider in all of this. For example, let's go back to the DGS duology because, of course, and look at the third cases. Now this is where it gets really odd, because one of these games has a third case that's extraordinarily short, while the other has one that's extraordinarily long, specifically for being a third case, of course. And I don't know if I'm the only one who feels this way, but I can't help but find it just so strange comparing a case that goes on for about 4 hours to one that goes on for about 10. I mean, I do understand that they're both the third cases that sort of formally introduce the main plot of their respective games, and are also the fan favourites, but when you look at the cases individually, they're just so different in length that comparing them feels slightly asinine. This sort of issue with case length is something I also often think about when it comes to the first Turnabout, because it's basically a 25-minute to 30-minute long case. It just becomes so awkward trying to compare this to the cases later on, especially the ones in the DGS duology. In fact, I could probably finish the entirety of the first Turnabout and Turnabout Sisters before the adventure of the Great Departure, if I'm going to be honest. Moving on with this point that just because 2 cases have the same number doesn't necessarily mean you should compare them directly as a comparison between the 3rd and 4th cases of Trials and Tribulations and those of DGS1. So if you were to compare The Revenge of the Runaway Rome and Recipe for Turnabout, I would honestly have to say that I think that the adventure of the runaway room basically blows Recipe for Turnabout out of the water. I like both cases, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I may be the only one who likes Recipe for Turnabout now that I think about it, but I don't even think it's a comparison, and similar sort of thing occurs if you compare Turnabout Beginnings to the Adventure of the Clouded Conqueror, though again, I do like both cases. So if you would just look at it this way, it seems this comparison is pretty equal, except it's sort of backwards, because while the numbers add up, actually look at the cases. We're taking the trial-only case that's very integral to the plot and ends in a disaster from Trials and Tribulations, and comparing it to the case that doesn't really have much relevance and more just there for fun in DGS, and taking the trial-only case that's very integral to the plot that ends in a disaster from DGS, and comparing it to the case that doesn't really have much relevance and is more so just there for fun in Trials and Tribulations. So maybe we should just actually reverse these, and in that case, while I am ruining my bias quite greatly, I think both of DGS's cases are still better, to be perfectly honest. Of course, this leads to quite a different conclusion than earlier, so maybe the issue is that we should compare every case to every case. After all, while the initial comparison I did only consider how each case ranks up to its equivalent if we're just going by numbers, comparing one of them to each other would look more like this and have a clear winner. The same as the one we got when we reversed them, and sure, it probably makes more sense than the direct method, but from the reversal, we also sort of get this idea of a case having a specific purpose in the narrative, and how that means you cannot just directly compare it to anything. I suppose I already mentioned this when I asked whether a case should have to stand on its own, but it really is just so fascinating, because when you think about it, ZSlyer is in this weird middle ground with how it structures its games, because it separates the parts of the stories just enough that you want to compare them as separate stories, but at the same time, doing so is arguably dismissive of how these cases play the role in the game. To be honest, it sort of reminds me of the Yakuza series, and I know this is an Ace-Tone video, but bear with me here. From Yakuza 1 to Yakuza 3, the games were split into chapters, and that's it. That meant that the focus of the story and the way it was judged was nearly always on the overall, because it was always clearly one continuous narrative that was being told. Then with Yakuza 4 and 5, however, this changed a little bit with the part system. What I mean by that is that the stories started to be told from different characters, all of which had a part to them, and so due to this structure, while there was still an overall story, the ability to judge these parts individually also existed, and since they were about separate characters who wouldn't really even meet until the end of the game, they had to all be self-reliant to some extent. I think an interesting situation occurred due to this when I was playing Yakuza 5, as I really didn't like Shinada's part because it felt so much detached from the rest of the story and only served to slow down what I already thought was a story too slow. However, I later watched a review of Yakuza 5 from a YouTuber I really like, but also don't know how to pronounce the name of, in which he praised Shinada's part instead, and what was fascinating about this for me was how it clearly showed a difference in how we were viewing the story. I didn't enjoy Shinada's part because I saw it as something that didn't need to exist in the story and only served to model it. However, the YouTuber in question instead judged Shinada's part as an individual story. And because of that, I was able to appreciate it in a way I was not able to do so beforehand. Wait, wasn't this video about Ace-Turning? Well, to be honest, with that detour, I've really gone over everything I wanted to say about the structure of Ace-Turning, and I suppose video games as a whole and how we section them, considering I randomly brought in Yakuza to the situation. And so, with that out of the way, you might be wondering, what am I really trying to say here? Yeah, I don't really know either.